Welcome. I thought that today we could discuss fear and love as two motivators. And can you let them know? Two things. Close it. Okay, they figured it out. I thought we'd talk about fear and love as two motivators in spirituality. So a lot of times we critique a fear-based conception of divinity because of its obvious limitations. If you look at the Krishna conception of divinity, in contrast to what you might call a classical conception of divinity, a real good way to understand and appreciate the difference is to look at fear over love. So, a classical conception of divinity. Can we get that door closed and also ask them to be quiet? Thank you. I'm just going to start again because somehow everybody comes in after I start. A classical conception of divinity that you would get if you were to go to most temples or mosques or churches is that God is male and capable of punishment, and that you should behave, and you should behave so that you do not undergo some kind of punishment. God's powerful, God's a father figure, God's capable of violence, God's omnipotence should inspire awe at the very least, or even fear, and that if you don't behave, bad things will happen to you, and therefore you have a reason to be moral because somebody's watching and you can get in trouble. Does this make sense? Okay. Can you go inform Radhika to keep the kids quiet? Thank you. I think that's a general classical conception of divinity and how it's used to inspire morality or good behavior in the world. Would you guys agree? And whether that's stated overtly, like I just did, or whether it's covertly stated and it's implicit and it's just understood, most people have a classical conception of divinity. God is male, parental, paternalistic, fatherly, capable of punishment or protection, and that you behave properly and you'll get you'll get good. And this really gets into like straight behaviorism, where people will do one thing to achieve pleasure and they'll do even more to avoid pain. Skinner found out in his experiments in the 40s and 50s that although people want pleasure, they'll do even more to avoid pain. And so that threat of violence or pain and the fear that ensues from that threat of violence or pain is an incredible motivator. You guys follow this? Interestingly, they did an experiment with rats where they walked across a cage that was gradually heated up, so the floor of the cage became hotter and hotter. And they would get to one side or the other side, and then they would get cocaine, but then they wouldn't be able to double dip. They'd have to run across the cage to get cocaine on the other side, and they had a little dispenser unit, but you could only touch it once. And so they would run back and forth. They figured out, rats are smart. They can figure this out, that you get it here, and then you have to go over here and get it, and you get it here, and you go back and forth. And with cocaine, they would run back and forth as the plate heated up, but they eventually would run back and forth until they died. Which makes you really wonder, what we're dealing with when you look at drugs and their effects on the brain and dopamine and being deprived of that. And is it really the acquisition of pleasure or the avoidance of pain? How do you want to view it? It's kind of like a cup is half full, cup is half empty type of thing. I would argue that when people become addicted to drugs, what they're really doing is they're avoiding pain. They're avoiding pain. It's a personal theory. But yeah, anyway, it's not super relevant, but I do think the basic principle that people are extremely motivated to avoid pain, and therefore, if just look at how we get people to behave properly on the road with traffic laws. Why do people drive the appropriate speed and follow stop signs and traffic lights and things like that? They do it because if they don't, the police pull them over and give you an expensive ticket. Why do they pull over? Because the police will eventually ram you with their car. And throw down spikes and shoot you if you don't pull over. Just out on the street with a police force, even in a relatively civilized country like the U.S., there's this threat of violence. Police officers overtly carry guns with them so people can see them. They open carry so you understand what you're dealing with. They have other weapons, and they're plainly displayed. If you go to Germany or someplace like that, or France, the police officers or India, the police officers in the airports all carry machine guns. Have you ever noticed that? We don't have that in the U.S. But they have. Have you ever noticed this? As a cop, you notice this, right? It's unusual. Just
even Mexico, when I was going through the border, just walking through the border, the guy at the magnetometer, he had a machine gun, just checking backpacks.
yeah. So airports are these critical points of entry, and so we don't do it in the U.S. But in other countries, it's like in India. They're all dressed in military fatigues. They're not. It's like no joke. It's like they're in military fatigue. They got flak jackets on and they carry machine guns. And it's really understood they're going to control that space. There's a show of force, and it works. Our legal system works this way. And really, if you think about it philosophically, when you have a legal system, ultimately the legal system exists on the basis that it represents the will of God in this world. When you look at constitutions that are the foundation of legal systems, even in the U.S., where we try to have a separation between church and state, we still ultimately invoke in our Constitution that all men are created equally and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And so there's your foundational document. We're telling you that there are fundamental rights that God gave you, and the purpose of this document is to protect those fundamental rights. Did you follow this? So ultimately, when you get pulled over by a police officer, it's the authority of the city that they're in, which is in consonance with the authority of the state, the county and the state that they're in, which is in consonance with the authority of the federal government, which is in consonance with the Constitution, which derives its power because it represents the will of God and the natural order of things. Did you follow this? And so really, when somebody tries to enforce the legal system on you, ultimately, if you push them hard enough, they'll say, this is the natural order. This is the ultimate way the universe was created. These are the inalienable rights of man given by the ultimate right giver. And it's very, very hard to come up with a fully secularized system because you have to ultimately invoke some absolute authority as the genesis of the legal system you're putting forward. So, if you look at the Christian conception of divinity, to a large extent, the Christian conception of divinity is contrastable with a classical conception of divinity. Classical, again, being that God is male, fatherly, maybe even paternalistic, that carries a little bit of condescension with it. And there you should be afraid because God is capable of violence and punishment. And if you don't behave, bad things will happen to you. That's the major motivator. The minor motivators, if you behave, good things will also come to you. If you don't behave, bad things will happen. If you do behave, good things will come to you. That is classic religion 101. Sometimes it's stated overtly. Sometimes it's stated covertly or just implied. But most of us are moral because we're afraid of what might happen to us if we're immoral. Before people's natural conscience and desire to be good kicks in, the fear of punishment for doing the wrong thing kicks in. And you can just look at your life and why you follow traffic laws as a simple example for this. Prabhupada one time said locks keep the on the donation box, on the hundi, keep the honest person honest. If you don't put a lock, then even an honest person may be tempted to steal from you. But at least your average person with some small threats and some small safeguards will respect. But if you don't have that, if you ever were to go to a country where it was just a recommendation for how fast you should drive or what rules you should follow, like the Autobahn in Germany, for example, people will just go big. They'll go big. Interestingly, it's unusual, the U.S., compared to the rest of the world. I've driven all over the world. I've driven in India, Australia, all over Europe and Russia and South America and in the U.S. And so I've driven in the U.K. I mean, there's the whole Brazil. There's the whole left side, right side of the road thing, which is, a huge difference in most of the world. But in most of the world, if you're on the freeway and you're going fast, cars in the fast lane will pull over into the slow lane automatically. It's just understood. People are a little bit more civilized than the rest of the world. And so they just automatically get out of the way. Like, they get it. You're going in the fast lane, so they just pull over because they're going slower, you're going faster, and so they pull out of the way for you. Growing up in Southern California, which even within the U.S. has a very, very aggressive system of driving, even compared to the rest of the state, what to speak of other states, California is incredibly aggressive in terms of driving. And I've driven in Miami and Chicago and New York City as well, extensively. Trucks, big vehicles. But California, Southern California specifically, for me, has the most aggressive, and specifically Los Angeles County, where I grew up, LA City, where I grew up, is the most aggressive drivers on the planet. I mean, forget the fact that we actually in the 80s got into shooting people on the freeway. That there was a whole, scores and scores of episodes of gunplay on the freeway during traffic in the 80s. This has calmed down to a large extent, but this was a big thing when I was growing up, when I was a teenager. Forget that, which sort of says it all. But and other states weren't doing that. That was us. I mean, there's some little limited scope, but it was normal. How old are you, Howard?
45, sir.
You remember, right?
Yes.
I mean, whatever. We're the birthplace of the Crips and the Bloods. Gang culture, largely, like in extreme forms, took birth in Los Angeles, post-Watts riot in the 70s, as the aftermath of what happened when the civil rights movement failed. And so there's that, and we had a lot of gang violence. But this drive-by shooting phenomenon was real. It's kind of a combination of our aggressive driving style and drive-by shootings, and they kind of came together and it became freeway shootings, which was this unique Southern California, Los Angeles phenomenon. But even with the exception of that, driving in Los Angeles is extremely aggressive. So when I'm driving on the road, just naturally just go around people and meander through traffic, assuming that slow drivers are going to try to mess with me, because that's what people do in Southern California. It's like crabs in a barrel, and everybody wants to punish you and make you drive as slow as they are. So they'll purposefully stop you from driving more, efficiently than they are, and they'll move into lanes to stop you or speed up so you can't get in. It's the opposite of how everybody else in the rest of the world drives. And which created problems for me, because I'd be in Australia, in the outback in Australia, and I'd be driving down a freeway, a 2-lane freeway, and I'd be driving, whatever my pace was, be some little podunk pickup truck in front of me, and so I would then, fade out to go around the vehicle, and they would also go, and I'd have to move back into the original lane. I was in this lane, they were in this lane. I then go here to go around them, but then they go like that, because they're trying to get out of my way. You follow? Anyway, that was all just a big tangent. If you had a system where people didn't have to follow the rules of the road, things would be much different. People would be driving 100 all the time. It may be safer or less safe, it depends, because the Autobahn, where people can drive as fast as they want to, within reason, is famous for not having terrible accidents, because what goes along with that is a culture where people respect each other on the road. And I thought of, if you didn't have rules, and I thought of a place where they didn't have rules, the Autobahn in Germany. Then I thought of how they actually have very, very low rates of accidents. And then I realized the reason why was because they have a whole different culture of respect when they drive. And so it's a combination of the rules and the lack of culture. And if you don't want to have the rules, people have to be way more cultured in order to pull it off. Did you guys follow that? All right. Now you guys know how this little hamster wheel in my head works. We generally focus on a love-based conception of divinity. And so Krishna largely is contrastable to a typical fear-based conception. And so a typical fear-based conception is that God is male, fatherly, paternalistic, again that means a little condescending, and that you should be afraid because punishment will ensue if you misbehave, and you have to follow the rules, and somebody's watching. I think that classical conception has a lot of value, despite the fact that my tradition, the tradition I'm a part of, the tradition I'm attracted to, is largely definable by going the opposite direction. And the opposite direction would be a love-based conception of divinity. So if you look at Krishna, Krishna doesn't hold a scepter or a lightning bolt. He holds a flute, which is just, it makes beautiful music and attracts people. It's intriguing. It's sexy. Krishna, in a lot of ways, is a transcendental conception of Cupid. The very word Krishna means the all-attractive one, the all-loving one, the most beautiful one. If you look at the way Krishna is depicted, it's a little bit Mona Lisa-esque. There's a little bit masculine, a little bit feminine, very, very soft. Krishna's not angry. Oftentimes, Krishna is depicted as a child. The most unfair, it's the opposite of a paternal deity, motherly or fatherly. It's a child, totally unthreatening. It's totally subversive. Children are in need of care. It evokes desires to care in you. You want to care for God, which is totally anachronistic and subversive and almost mind-bending. That you need to care for Krishna. You need to love Krishna. You need to nurse Krishna. If you look at the iconography, Yashoda breastfeeding Krishna. It's like how do you even wrap your head around that? The soul of the universe, the cause of all cause, the creator of everything, is being nurtured and cared for and protected. You see how it's just the opposite? Does that make sense? And so instead of a love-based relationship, a fear-based relationship, it's a love-based relationship. Did you guys follow that? Even though that's our thing, and I can give you verses as evidence of that, we have the other thing in our back pocket, the fear-based conception. And it usually shows up in the same text, but I had a particular verse I wanted to read today that I think is interesting. Mad bhayat. Mad means me. Bhaya. Bhaya means fear. Like Prabhupada's birth name was Abhay, one who's not afraid. You put an A in front of a Sanskrit word, just like English, theist, atheist. So you put an in front of a word in Sanskrit, it usually means the opposite. If the word starts with an A, then you put an A-N in front of the word. There's different things that happen. Anyway, so Madbhayat, out of fear, from fear. Then there's what's called the ablative. Madbhayat vati vato yam. Out of fear of me, this wind blows. Like vata, kapha, pitta, the three humors of Ayurveda. So this is Madbhayat vati vato yam. Out of fear of me, this wind blows. Suryastapati madbhayat. Out of fear of me, the sun shines, the sun heats. Tapati, like tapasya. Tapati takes the root tap and makes it into a verb. Tapati means it shines, it heats. Out of fear of me, Surya is the Sanskrit word, one of the Sanskrit words for sun. Surya tapati madbhayat. Varshati Indro Dahati Agnir. Mrityus Charati Madbhayat. Again, out of fear of me. Mrityu Charati. Death moves. Death kills. That's a kind of a poetic way. Death moves out of fear of me. Death acts out of fear of me. And then Agni, Dahati, fire burns. Agni is where you get the word ignite from in English. Agni means fire. Dahati means burns. And then Varshati Indra. Indra gives rain. The sort of Zeus of the Vedic pantheon was Indra, and he makes it rain. Varshati. Varsha means rain. Varshati means rains. And so Varshati Indro. Indra makes it rain. Mrityu Charati. Death moves. And Agni Dahati. Fire burns. Vati. Vati Vataha, and then the wind blows, and Surya Tapati, the sun shines out of fear of me. It's a good verse, right? Similar ideas are given even earlier than this. This is in the Bhagavatam, it's an ancient text, but even earlier ideas in the Upanishads, in the previous layer of Vedic text. The same idea is given. Out of fear of the supreme, the wind blows. That's a beautiful verse. Madbhayat vati vato yam suryastapati madbhayat vashatindro dahatyagnir mrityuscharati madbhayat. Out of fear of me, the wind blows, the sun shines, fire burns, the clouds give rain, and death moves. This indicates that Krishna is ultimately at the top of the totem pole, the top of the food chain. Krishna is the apex predator. And so if you look at the universe and how it's constructed, then all these things are going on out of deference to, respect to, out of fear of Krishna. When we talk about FOMO, fear of missing out, I don't actually think that that's the proper use of the word fear, although we do use the word in English to mean anxiety. I think it would be better we said AOMO, but it doesn't sound quite as cool, so it'd be anxiety of missing out. I think that's really what we mean. I think at least the way I want to define fear, and if you know a language, you can say, I want to use the word in this particular way. Because you can say, I love a movie. Or I love, English muffins. Like, I grew up loving English muffins. But I don't eat food that's cooked in a restaurant. So the only time I ever get English muffins is if my wife takes the trouble to make English muffins. And they're relatively difficult to make, and so, for 30 years, I've had English muffins maybe like 4 times in 32 years, something like that. So I love English muffins. I really love English muffins. But I don't really love English muffins, because I can't even say that. I really love English muffins. This is what happens when you know a language. I can say, I really love English muffins. I don't really love English muffins. And you guys can understand what I mean. I really love them means I like them as far as you can like a foodstuff. And I'm going to sensationalize that and describe it as love, although I don't actually mean love. Like, I don't love English muffins the same way I love my children. So I might use the same word, but I really mean 2 different things. So I mean, when I say I love that book, or of course with our scriptures maybe there's a different level of love. But if I say I love a magazine, or I love a TV show, or I love a foodstuff, I mean insofar as you can love that stuff. Like people sometimes say I'm a pup mom or a pup dad, and they describe their feeling for their dogs as being the same as a feeling of a parent for their children. I've never met somebody who actually has kids who talks like that. It's only people who are in the prepubescent phase of life, where they haven't actually had their own children, become a mother or father, who would make such foolish statements. Do you follow this? Once you grow up and go through puberty, and actually I'm using the word puberty here in a slightly different way, because I mean once you grow up and actually have your own kids, then you realize your love for your animals is not exactly the same. for any number of reasons. I don't want to spend too much time on it. But their cognitive deficiencies and the fact that you have basically a slave-master relationship with them where they depend on you for food and life as domesticated animals who can't provide for themselves nullifies some sort of deep, loving relationship. And when you love a child, there's this possibility that child will develop and become capable of reciprocating with you, and that's the promise. And when you have people who are capable of more growth, and there's more possibility for love. Of course, if you did have a child who had the intelligence level of a dog, you could love that child, but you would love them much more similarly to how you love an animal. And so if you had a kid who was incredibly mentally retarded and had never had the possibility of growing up to be more, let's say, mature than a puppy, like 13 months or something like that, then you could compare those two things. But love is based on the complexity and ability and reciprocation and equality and so many other features which are not there in an animal-human relationship. Did you guys follow this? Our legal system reflects this. That's why you can go to leave your dog at home alone all day, and they don't call child protective services. There's the whole idea of trying to compare these two things is it's actually offensive. When somebody says I'm a pup parent, it's actually offensive to parents of human children. They're guilty of cultural appropriation, parental appropriation. We should start a movement against it. So I can say, in English you can say you love something, and then people know you mean as far as, thanks, if I don't love it, then I mean compared to how I would love a person. I don't love English muffins the same way I love other people. If you master a language, you can do that. And if you talk to other black belts in your language, which means fluent speakers, they follow you. If you're talking to somebody who doesn't know your language, they get bewildered when you do this stuff. Does that make sense? So I think fear, for the way I want to define it for the purpose of this conversation, fear is a threat. There's a threat of punishment. And I think most people are afraid of God. They don't want to do the wrong thing. Otherwise, God will punish them. Think about it. Don't take my word for it. Think about when you make mistakes and you're thinking about your mistakes in relationship to God, if you're afraid that you're going to be punished for your misdeeds. Are you? I'm actually asking, I'm looking for nods or shaking of the heads. If you shake your head no, I'm coming for you. You don't have a fear?
I was just trying to think if I did or not.
So go ahead and do it. I'm bewildered that at the age of 40 you haven't thought about this. That's strange to me. Extremely strange to me. I don't guess. Think it through, guys. I don't think what I'm asking is some really exotic question. If you didn't believe in God, you wouldn't be here, number one. So you have some conception of some kind of higher power. Otherwise, what are you doing in the Hare Krishna temple unless it's a school project? So all of you believe in God. All of you have misbehaved in your life. Raise your hand if you've never misbehaved ever in your life. That's right. You've all misbehaved in any number of ways that you don't want to tell us. You've all done things you're ashamed of. We had a TV screen showing you doing some of the bad things you've done in life. You would be very embarrassed. So when you think about the mistakes you've made, the ones that you don't share with people and wear a t-shirt of, and you think about what's going to happen to you and how God feels about that, do you ever feel fear? And I don't mean right now, today. I mean, have you ever in your entire life felt afraid of being punished by an omnipotent, supreme, paternal deity for having done something wrong? Of course you have. There's value in that. There's value in that. Fear keeps criminally minded people in line. It's got to be there in a religious tradition. It's part of it. Madhvayat vati vato yam. Out of fear of me, the wind blows. Surya tapati madhvayat. Out of fear of me, the sun shines. Varshatindro dahati agni mrityuscharati madhvayat. And out of fear of me, the clouds rain, fire burns, and death kills. This is an acknowledgement that at the top of the food chain, there is a deity, and the laws of the universe are in consonance with the laws of God. Just like the Constitution argues. You guys following this? Okay. If that's all you have, then you have a crippled religion. If you don't have that, nobody's going to listen. If that's all you have, you're crippled. What you really need is a fear-based, avoid pain, into a love-based, achieve pleasure. But it's a little bit simplistic. Love goes beyond personal pleasure. So I don't know if the behavioral model fully encapsulates what a love-based conception of God leads to. And Krishna really represents a love-based deity, but still not. I mean, when push comes to shove, Krishna lifts Govardhan Hill. You follow? When push comes to shove, Krishna defeats Indra with his rain clouds. You follow? When push comes to shove and Yashoda looks in Krishna's mouth because her son ate dirt and she's afraid he ate dirt. And she looks in his mouth, she sees the sun and the moon in Krishna's mouth and the entire universe in Krishna's mouth because he's the source of all creation. When Yashoda binds Krishna to protect him from himself because he's been naughty, then he liberates the twin Arjun trees by taking the ulukala and pulling the grinding mortar in between the two Arjun trees, and he liberates them. And so, bound by love, Krishna gives liberation. Protected by his mother, Krishna is still the source of the universe. And playing like a child, Krishna still defeats Indra. And so if you want to have a proper conception of Krishna, even as a child, subversive, in need of being nurtured and cared for and protected, and all those beautiful ideas that are there in our iconography, in our conception of divinity, you have to balance that out with good old-fashioned, regular old classical divinity. It's classical divinity plus. It's contrastable to in the way we cultivate love for divinity. It's not contrastable in the sense of what's actually going on. What's actually going on is the classical conception and more. The classical conception without the limitations that the classical conception gives. The benefits of a fear-based relationship without any of the crippling effects. Loving your pup and loving humans. You follow? It's everything. It's the bigger picture. It's A through Z, the alpha through the omega. And you find we have both verses. Both types of verses. Loving, sweet verses and very fierce verses. And they exist side by side, and it's somewhat vexing because we want one way to think about divinity. Now, you could just have two verses where Krishna is lovingly saying, don't worry, I love you, I'll take care of you, you're so dear to me, whatever you're going through, I'll help you with. And then you could contrast it to, I'm capable of punishing you and everything's going on by fear of me. And, you're just left with two mutually exclusive concepts of divinity with no way for them to be hewn together. Did you follow that? Human means separating or joining? I think it actually means separating. I gotta look it up. It's like archaic English. I'm not real practiced in my old English. But without a way for these two ideas to be married together, to be synergized. So you're left with sort of two, it's like oil and water. Did you guys follow this? Oil is hydrophobic. And water is hydrophilic. Water loves water, and oil does not like water. So if you want to join them together, you have to get a third compound where one end of the molecule is hydrophobic and the other end of the molecule is hydrophilic, and then that thing joins together, and that's what they have to add to salad dressing if it's an oil and vinegar based salad dressing. They have to add something so it doesn't separate and require to be shook up every time. Lecithin would be an example of an emulsifier, which has the ability to bind these two substances which generally don't bind together because of their molecular structure. Did you guys follow that? Okay. So, looking for a binder between these two ideas about divinity, both of which have values and both of which have limitations. A love-based conception without some conception of, it becomes almost like Aesop's fables or a folktale. Krishna just becomes a real loving character, but not the omnipotent supreme Lord, cause of all causes. The fear-based relationship without the love-based relationship really cripples you, and you're just always trying to get out of trouble. And so what you need is you need to be able to use both at various points in your life to motivate you to stay on the straight and narrow and do the right thing, but not become limited to just having this incredibly oppressive relationship with divinity, this crippled notion of divinity, which eventually grows into a concept of like an eternal hell, and you'd be sent to hell, and you're being punished, and Krishna's angry, and you don't even want to go to heaven. You just want to avoid hell. So you got to find some way to put these two things together. But they're like oil and water. And so I think one way to do that is to take a little bit of a closer look at our theology. When you turn away from Krishna, he doesn't punish you. Verses like this, out of fear of me, all these things are going on, it's a little sensationalist. When you turn away from Krishna, he doesn't punish you. Krishna allows you to turn away and go your own way and pay your own way. And paying your own way is called the law of karma. Karma is not an angry deity punishing you for misbehaving in a way that should create fear. Karma is Krishna letting you do your own thing and go your own way and pay as you go. There's no angry deity punishing you. There's Krishna stepping back from being too dramatically involved in your life and allowing you to make your own mistakes and do your own thing and succeed or fail. Did you guys follow this? That's the law of karma. As such, there's no real need to be afraid of Krishna. There's a need to take ownership of the natural repercussions of your actions. And to own that everything you do will come back to you. Good, bad, and ugly. Provided you're willing to take ownership of getting the just results of your actions and living in a just universe where you pay as you go and the law of cause and effect takes place as it should, as is reasonable, then there's no reason to ever be afraid of Krishna. this idea of being afraid of God is like there's this sadistic, powerful entity that like can be mean and cruel to you. You follow? And so one of the ways to resolve a paradox is you take two statements which are mutually exclusive and you minimize one of them. And so I would do that here. Although the verse says, Madbhayat Vati Vatoyam, out of fear of me, the wind blows. Surya Tapati Madbhayat, out of fear of me, the sun shines. Varshatindro Dahati Agni Mrityuscharati Madbhayat, and out of fear of me, the clouds rain and fire burns and death moves in this world, through entropy. It's not really what's meant. What's really meant is that there is some natural order to the world. If you go your own way in this world, you naturally get a chance to pay your bill and get the just deserts of your actions. But there's nothing like an angry, violent, omnipotent being up in a cloud with a lightning bolt ready to smite you or smote you. There's just you having to pay as you go. Having to take responsibility for what you do and the natural ramifications of what you do. Narayan's on my computer writing. That's what's going on there. For me, making that little adjustment in the way I relate to a fear-based deity takes away the fear, and it's replaced with soberness and ownership and maturity and responsibility, which I think is very healthy. And now I'm left with a love-based conception of divinity, but I'm left in a universe where it's not ruled by chaos. And when there is some natural cause and effect, there is some natural order to things, and an all good God would definitely create that without forcing it down your throat, and there's a law of karma. And so really, if you want to be afraid, you should be afraid of yourself and the trouble you can get yourself into, but not externalize that and project that onto somebody else and blame them. And I think that does a lot to rehabilitate our conception of divinity and allow us to deal with the heaviness and the responsibility and the sobriety that goes along with owning our time in this world, and at the same time having a love-based conception of divinity that doesn't become kitschy or shallow or, I don't know, unnecessarily optimistic and immature. Did you guys follow that? So just to wrap it all up, most religions have a fear-based conception of God. God is angry and violent, and if you misbehave, you'll be punished. If you follow that through to its natural conclusions, you wind up with God with a thunderbolt smiting and smoting people, getting angry, people sending them to hell forever. And you're paralyzed because there's this incredibly powerful entity that's omniscient, and he's keeping score. And he's a male, he's a father, he's paternalistic, he's condescending, and he's capable of extreme violence and extreme prejudice. And there's value in that, because in behavioral science you learn to avoid pain. And we learn that animals and human beings will do more to avoid pain than they will even to achieve pleasure. But there's a limit to how deep you can go in a relationship like that, and such a conception of divinity starts to get kind of evil. and what's called dystheistic. So if you look at the Christian conception of divinity, Krishna's a boy. He's not even an adult. He's your child instead of your parent. He's more feminine than masculine. There's no weapons, no thunderbolt. Krishna's playing a flute. But if you look a little deeper, you find that that same Krishna has a universe inside his mouth, picks up a mountain range with his hand, and is capable of defeating any of the classical gods of the Indian pantheon. And so there's a balancing of power and love, which are both incredible motivating factors. And so if we take fear and love, they're antonyms, and it's difficult to reconcile those, and you never quite fall in love with Krishna because you're always still, on some level, afraid of him under the surface. And so one way to homogenize that and reconcile it and bring those two disparate ideas together is to, rather than conceiving of Krishna as being angry and violent, is to instead conceive of the law of karma. And that Krishna doesn't really punish you per se, despite sensationalist verses like this. But rather, Krishna lets you get the just deserts and just rewards of your actions, whatever they may be. And the result of deeply imbibing that notion is that you become sobered, you take responsibility, and at the same time you can have a loving conception of divinity that doesn't become shallow or trite. You can have a full conception of divinity without going too deep down that dark road of anger and fear. Okay. We're all done. Thank you very much. We'll do a little kirtan. Hare Krishna.